Donald Trump currently faces four separate criminal proceedings. One in South Florida brought by the Biden Justice Department through Special Counsel Prosecutor Jack Smith, which is the case that charges him with mishandling or pilfering without authorization, top secret, and other classified documents, and he's charged there under the Espionage Act. There are two cases that deal with Trump's post-election conduct that claim that he was essentially attempting to subvert democracy, a federal case in Washington, D.C., also with Jack Smith and the Biden Justice Department, and then one in Atlanta with an obviously Democratic Party prosecutor who has her own problems. Those cases, to the extent that you compare them, do assert serious charges if there were convictions. Trump could be convicted, for example, under the Espionage Act of taking classified material on purpose that he wasn't authorized to take and then refusing to give them back, or he can be convicted of subverting democracy and therefore attempting to launch a coup. Those are serious charges to be convicted of. We've gone over many times the severe weaknesses in those cases, but at least if you were to talk about convictions of that sort, you could see them having a very consequential impact on how many Americans perceive Donald Trump. I don't think that's the case for this criminal proceeding. In part because I think the perception will be that it's about nothing more than Donald Trump's relationship with Stormy Daniels and the attempt to cover that up. And I think in the 1990s, Americans showed when they continued to support Bill Clinton by fairly large amounts and even gave the Democratic Party the victory in 1998 in the midterms at the height of the Monica Lewinsky and Paula Jones scandal, that American voters don't really care that much about what they perceive to be personal or private lives. They don't care about that with their fellow citizens. They don't really care about it in their leaders. What they really care about most is that the president or people who are elected actually do things to improve their lives. Material improvement of their lives is by far the thing that drives them when they go to the ballot box. We've seen that over and over. It was only when Trump was leading Joe Biden in all of the polls did Democrats start plotting to charge him with crimes, with felonies all over the country, even though he went his entire life, 50 or 60 years, in all kinds of industries, including major New York real estate, without ever being charged with a crime, let alone convicted of one. And we talk all the time about how our enemy countries, how the bad countries, one of the things they do is they try and imprison their opponents and dissidents. How much did we hear about Vladimir Putin purposely imprisoning his leading political opponents, including Alexei Navalny, and he was even accused of having him murdered? So when we start talking about political leaders being imprisoned by their opposing government, by a government they oppose, we already have this sense that that is not something that really happens in the United States. And the question is going to be whether Americans perceive this route of collaboration as an abuse of the justice system by an extremely liberal prosecutor in Manhattan who did win in large part because a PAC was supporting him that received a massive donation from George Soros. So many other people. The U.S. Justice Department looked at these charges and said they're not going to bring the case. The prior district attorney, Cyrus Vance, looked at these charges and said he wouldn't bring the case. Alvin Bragg originally said this case can't be brought as felony charges, and he only changed his mind when prosecutors underneath him began screaming in public that he should do it, and they politically pressured him to do it, and then he finally brought it. And ultimately, the case is really about nothing other than hush payments to a porn star who alleges she had an affair with Donald Trump, even though previously she denied that, and a claim that in the books, in the internal books of the Trump organization, those payments to Michael Cohen, which then went to Stormy Daniels, were misclassified. So the case itself is just trivial, especially as a felony. And so, although I've always been a believer in trying to lift and eliminate this two-tier justice system where political elites and financial elites really are exempt in so many ways, not obviously absolutely, but overwhelmingly, I would be applauding this if I thought that this were fairly applied. The reality is there's only one person in all of the United States who would have been charged with 34 felonies, or even one felony, for having done this, and that person's name is Donald Trump. Democrats have been explicit about how they know that their best chance for winning is to ensure that Donald Trump becomes a felon before the election. Just to give you a sense for the absurdity of trying to suggest this was sort of the rule of law being applied equally, here from the New York Post in March 2020, and 2022 rather, you can watch the New York Post if you want. The story that they did on Hunter Biden's laptop turned out to be completely true, even though big tech and the media and the CIA all united to say it was Russian disinformation. And the facts that they're describing here are very easily verifiable. The headline is the Clinton campaign, the DNC, was fined by the Federal Election Commission for lying about the Steele dossier payments. Quote, the Federal Election Commission has fined both Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign and the Democratic National Committee for lying about how they spent money used to fund the now debunked Steele dossier on former President Donald Trump. The Clinton campaign and the DNC will be forced to pay $8,000 and $105,000 respectively for mislabeling payments that ultimately went to Fusion GPS, the consulting firm that commissioned the dossier according to FEC documents viewed by the Post. The fine stems from a complaint originally filed in 2018 by the Coolidge-Reagan Foundation, which was informed of the outcome on Tuesday. Now, obviously, that seems extremely similar to what Trump has been accused of. They wanted those payments to be hidden because they wanted to claim that they weren't the ones funding and instigating this fraudulent Steele dossier, and it turns out they absolutely were. And the intent was obviously to shield Hillary Clinton from damaging revelations, which is exactly the theory that they just convicted Trump on the basis of. But the reason you can say with certainty that these prosecutions were politically motivated is that Democrats, both in Congress and on Democratic Party channels, have said over and over that they believe it's urgent that these cases go to trial before the election because they realize that their best chance to get Joe Biden reelected, to drag him over the finish line, is to try and turn Donald Trump into a felon. This has been the strategy all along. Here, just as one of countless examples, is a CNN segment from December 16th of 2023.
Agree with me that Smith and Judge Chutkan are acting based on the election schedule.
I do agree with you, Michael, and I think any fair-minded observer has to agree with that as well. Just look at Jack Smith's conduct in this case. The motivating principle behind every procedural request he's made has been speed, has been getting this trial in before the election. Let's take a couple examples. The trial date. The average federal conspiracy and fraud trial takes about 1.5 to 2 years between indictment and trial. In this case, we have dozens, hundreds of January 6 rioters caught on video, straightforward cases. They too were given about 1.5 to 2 years between indictment and trial. Jack Smith originally requested a trial date for Donald Trump, a far more complex case, 5 months out. He wanted a January trial. It was set for 2 months later.
So just to be clear about what's happening here, and we have a bunch of videos where these kind of liberal pundits are saying it's crucial to convict Donald Trump before the election because they're relying on those polls we just showed you and putting their hope in the fact that people who are primed to vote for Trump won't do it because they believe the legal system is so sacred and honorable and reliable that if they find him guilty, it means he's not fit for the presidency. But in this case, Jack Smith's political motivations were so overt that CNN's very pro-Democratic Party and anti-Trump commentator, former prosecutor Eli Honig, and others went on CNN and said, this is unseemly what Jack Smith is doing. He so clearly is desperate to get these verdicts and trials into a court far more quickly than an average case would take because he's looking at the election day and the impact that these convictions could have on election day, which obviously, to put it mildly, it shouldn't even be required to say it, is totally inappropriate for a prosecutor to be thinking about. And yet, even for some of these liberal lawyers who go on these liberal networks and usually read right from the DNC script, the way in which these prosecutions were so overtly politicized offended basically lawyers who practice in these courts, including prosecutors. They understand exactly how these cases normally work, and the speed with which Jack Smith was trying to bring these trials to a verdict before Election Day is almost unheard of. And that's why he's been unsuccessful. It's almost certain that those 2 trials that he is prosecuting will not come to a verdict, will not be tried and finished before Election Day, nor will the documents case in Florida. This is the only verdict of any of those 4 cases that we are likely to have before Election Day. Again, legally, we've gone over many times why this case is preposterous and so dubious. And so the real question is, how will this be politically perceived? Will those polls turn out to be right, that even Republican voters, at least in small numbers, will abandon Trump if he's a convicted felon? Or will they have the view that I have, and that many other people have, that what this really is a politicized abuse of the criminal justice system to bring a case as a felony that has no right to be brought as a felony, for which there's no precedent, this theory that the prosecutors use to turn this into a felony, and that ultimately it's a trivial case that won't impact how Americans see Trump, but they very well might have an impact on how they look at the Biden administration.